All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Happy to welcome today David Sirota. He's an award-winning journalist, former Bernie Sanders speechwriter, and Oscar-nominated writer on the film Don't Look Up. He's also the founder of The Lever, a reader-supported investigative news outlet, and the host and creator of the Signal Award-winning podcast Master Plan. David Sirota, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Great to talk with you. For those who don't know, I've been listening to this podcast, The Master Plan. But if you would just give us a, because this is like a podcast series, it's a long answer. But could you just give us the Reader's Digest version of what is the Master Plan?
So our series, and we do seasons, each season takes a look at something that is happening in the present and tries to explain how it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen by accident, that much of what we're dealing with right now and much of what we're experiencing is the culmination of deliberate plans by specific sets of people who wanted specific sets of outcomes. So for the first season, a year and a half ago, was about the effort to, as I would characterize it, legalize corruption, make it easier to turn elections into auctions, to fully deregulate the campaign finance system and narrow the scope of anti-bribery laws to the point where they're almost unenforceable. And I think most people believe that we are living in a political system in which corruption has become endemic, that money has become the determining factor in politics, disproportionate to even the past. Now, I'm not idealizing the past. Money has always played a role. But the point being that didn't just happen overnight. That wasn't an accident. There was a deliberate campaign. There was a deliberate agenda to deregulate the campaign finance system. And so that was season one. Season two looks at the concentration of power in the executive branch, the supremacy of the executive branch over the other branches, certainly the disempowerment of Congress and what that has meant. And this season, I think, is obviously relevant. Donald Trump is using a lot of executive power, whether you like it or not. I think it's undeniable that he's wielding a lot of executive power. And I think a lot of people woke up after the election and now have convinced themselves that Donald Trump has created all of that executive power, rather than really understanding how the presidency itself was turned into a kingship over the course of many decades, involving a specific set of plans with a specific set of goals. And that's what our season really tells the story of.
And this new second season just came out a couple weeks ago, so it is fresh. But now there have been enough episodes, so you can probably binge several of them.
Yep.
But I want to talk about this unitary executive theory, how it evolved from a fringe legal concept into where we are today. Obviously, people need to go listen to this series. But look, I was led to sort of believe that, post Watergate, maybe the presidency had been weakened to a point where it was somewhat feeble. And I know Dick Cheney, of all people, nowadays Dick Cheney is seen as like a liberal hero, Dick and Liz Cheney. But this was a big project, I think, of Dick Cheney, that he wanted to strengthen the executive branch. But if you would just kind of walk us through maybe some of the high points or low points of where this started and how we got here.
Sure. So Watergate was seen as a high point, if you will, of executive power. It was or high point or low point, depending on how you characterize it. But it was seen as an example of an imperial presidency that had gotten out of control, that the president was using, and his minions were using their political power to go after the president's enemies. But it went well beyond that. I mean, this was a president, Richard Nixon campaigned very explicitly he was going to end the Vietnam War, and then months later was secretly, in an unauthorized fashion, expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia. He came into office and started impounding money that Congress had appropriated, and he started not being willing to use allow the executive branch to spend the money. So, I mean, that sounds very familiar to what happened when Donald Trump came in the second term, saying, "I know that there are these laws that Congress has passed, and Congress has the power of the purse, but I'm simply going to order my executive branch not to actually spend the money." And so all of that colluded after Watergate to create the idea that the presidency as an office had become too powerful. And after Watergate, there were a series of laws passed and reforms that tried to reassert congressional authority in some of these matters. There was the Budget Impoundment Act, which basically made it much harder for the president to try to do what Richard Nixon had done, cutting off funding. There was the War Powers Act, which tried to say that the president cannot do a unilateral military operation after a certain set period of time without an authorization from Congress. And so that backlash there was a real effort to assert congressional authority. And of course, that backlash created a backlash of its own. You mentioned Dick Cheney. I mean, Dick Cheney was the White House chief of staff under Gerald Ford right after Watergate. And you can see in the memos that we dug up, and you'll hear about them in our series, that Dick Cheney is at that point a very lonely voice for executive power. And not lonely, I mean, Gerald Ford didn't like having the executive authority taken away, but Dick Cheney was the real ideologue, along with Donald Rumsfeld, really trying to combat Congress's effort to take back power. Dick Cheney, and I didn't mention it, but one of the things that happened after Watergate was the Church Commission hearings into the government's use of surveillance, COINTELPRO, domestic surveillance. That was a huge set of issues in the post-Watergate period. And you see in these memos, Dick Cheney trying to prevent Congress from accessing executive branch information, citing privilege, trying to prevent Congress from getting access to the information it would need to do oversight. And I think all of that leads into the Reagan administration, where when Reagan gets power back for conservatives, you have a number of young lawyers who will sound familiar: John Roberts, John Bolton, Samuel Alito. They come into the Justice Department, and they are looking in statutes for ways they can take a broad view of statutes passed by Congress, a broad view of executive branch power, hiring and firing power, a broad view on war-making powers. So you see them fighting with Congress over what statutes allow, but all of this ultimately ends up being filtered into the cauldron of the Justice Department led by Ed Meese. Ed Meese is a towering ideological figure in the Reagan administration with the Heritage Foundation and the like. And what Ed Meese and his, as we call it, legal A-team create in the Justice Department, they take all of these threads and they put it together inside of a unitary executive theory, which I think is important to understand the distinction, which is instead of, they get so frustrated with fighting over what congressionally passed laws will allow them or not allow them to do, that they come up with an idea that, wait a minute, if we have a constitutional argument that we are allowed, that we can make, we can say none of these laws that Congress has passed are legal on their face. And they come up with the idea that the Constitution's Article 2 powers gives them total and complete full control, one man full control over the executive branch, and that the Congress cannot limit that power over the executive branch, and independent agencies cannot be independent. And so they create a constitutional argument, and they start going into court with a constitutional argument saying, hey, we're not arguing whether that statute will let us do this or not do this. We're arguing that the statute itself is unconstitutional. And that has led into where we are now.
Yeah, I wonder, Dick Cheney, all the things he said about Donald Trump toward the end of his life, I wonder if he ever regretted. Do we know if he ever said anything about this empowering someone like Trump?
It's a great question. I mean, we call some of these people, we use the metaphor of some of these people are sort of the the leopard ate my face kind of people, like, or
Yes.
they created a monster and then they're shocked that the monster is coming after them, right? I mean, Dick Cheney's a great example. Here's a guy who was genuinely the most aggressive, outspoken advocate for presidential power in the 20th and early 21st century. This was his cause. If you had to look at the totality of Dick Cheney's career, that was the central organizing principle of his career. This is a guy who was led the minority report of the Iran-Contra affair. Iran-Contra, which we delve into, was really a scandal about whether the president and the White House could ignore congressionally passed laws, very explicitly saying you cannot fund covert military operations in Central America. Dick Cheney, on the investigative committee as the representative of the Republicans, the minority report, is a lonely voice at the end of that whole scandal saying the problem was actually Congress. The problem was that Congress passed a law saying what the president could and could not do in terms of covert military operations, right? So this has been the cause of Dick Cheney's life, and I don't think anybody asked him, like, do you have any regrets? Do you have any regrets that you created the turnkey system that you're now worried about? And look, we did ask Ed Meese. Ed Meese is still around. We did get an interview with Ed Meese, and Ed Meese did not express regrets for putting forward the unitary executive theory. And I don't know exactly what that means. And I do think it's worth having a discussion about where the right balance for presidential power actually is. I mean, this has been a long-running debate. There's always been a push and pull. But it is kind of interesting that many of the people who participated in creating an all-powerful presidency seem somewhat uncomfortable with the particular president using those particular powers now.
Did Meese ever has Meese criticized Trump? If so, I'm not aware of that.
No, but what's interesting was, there's been he left the Heritage Foundation. There's been this battle inside the Heritage Foundation that's been somewhat opaque, but it seems to be roughly about the sort of old Reagan style conservatives versus the Trump MAGA style conservatives, and that's created some internal issues at Heritage. I'm not sure if Meese left the Heritage Foundation because of that. He didn't really talk to us about that, so I'm not sure. But I do think this is a very live set of questions of whether conservatives think the unitary executive theory has gone too far. And by the way, on the Democratic side, there's going to be a very big question about whether, if they ever win back the presidency, what they should do with all of this newly concentrated power in the White House. Are they going to simply use their power to relinquish that power and to rebalance power? Or there will be a lot of pressure on them to simply use the power to implement their agenda. And I would say, look, one thing I think is not really acceptable would be that every time the Republicans get in office, they concentrate and use that power aggressively. And every time Democrats get in office, they don't use that power or relinquish it. Like that does not seem like a sort of balance that's acceptable.
Now, unilateral disarmament.
Exactly.
As you noted, this is a perennial argument, and maybe it has more to do with who's in power at a given moment, as opposed to a deep commitment to a philosophical worldview. Although with some people, they are. I think Cheney really was, at least for decades, committed to this cause. For other people, it's more probably situational and opportunistic. But when this episode airs, we will have just had another No Kings protest. And that taps into, I think, just a long-running sense among Americans that we like checks and balances. We don't like it. We don't want a king. We overthrew a king, and that's like a bipartisan, deeply embedded part of the American psyche. Then I think there's this other thing that's like, let's just get stuff done. Like technicalities and niceties. Let's have someone who just gets things done and cuts through the red tape. And like, I think there's like a real tension here that cuts across like all sorts of divides. And like, so I guess one question I have is like, is this are there times in our history you think where we're more prone to one than the other, or is this just always going to be a fight that we have to have?
I think it's always going to be a fight that we're going to be having. I, but I will say, I, I think we like to talk about how we don't want kings, but I suspect that what's really going on is a lot of people just don't like it when the king is somebody they don't like, and they want their
Yes.
king. And I think it's, by the way, I think this extends to free speech. Free speech is my right to speak. Oh, you're saying something I don't like. I'm not necessarily for your right to speech or to have your speech amplified, right? I think there's like a cognitive dissonance that we know the principle has validity, but in practice, we're not necessarily comfortable with the principle in different situations. And I think that is really, when I think about the No Kings protest, I do wonder if what's being said is we simply do not like this king. And I think the argument would be, well, if you don't like this king, but you want your king, you're not really against kings. You just don't like the current regime. And my hope is that is that the lesson that comes out of what Donald Trump is doing for both sides is the ultimate lesson that you could tell the founders themselves were trying to write into the Constitution. There's a lot of debates about what the Constitution says, doesn't say, there's gaps, et cetera, et cetera. Did they have foresight enough to understand how the document would be applied today? All those debates are legitimate and up for interpretation. I don't think what's up for interpretation, though, what's not really up for debate is the Constitution is a fundamentally anti-monarch document. The premise of the whole document is power should be somewhat dispersed. Power should be somewhat diffuse, or at least spread around, because one person having all the power is not a good idea. I think that's baked into the very premise of the Constitution. And I do think that does cause tension with people's demand and desire for things to happen. I think there is a legitimate, understandable angst that we have election after election after election, and we often feel like we're voting for change, voting for change, voting for change, and getting more of the same. And that creates, I think, the environment for more authoritarian, certainly presidential candidates, to say, just elect me and I will ram through everything, regardless of whether I'm respecting the democratic, small d democratic institutions in our society. So I understand the angst. And I think what we're living through is a culmination of both the powers that were concentrated in the White House and somebody, Donald Trump, who opportunistically understands that angst of people feeling like they're voting and not seeing any action. But it has colluded, I think, in ways that I think a lot of people don't like the idea that the president can wake up one day and impose global tariffs without any sort of process at all. The idea that the president can wake up one day and start World War III without any kind of authorization at all. I mean, that should be like a moment where we're saying, hey, maybe we don't want any president to have this kind of unilateral, impulsive power. That's at least my hope.
So you're talking about a sort of gridlock earlier that is making people more prone or more susceptible to authoritarian tendencies, because there's a sense that no matter what we do, nothing is
Right.
getting done. Do you think that are there things in place now that are worse than they used to be in terms of gridlock, or is it just the case that our attention spans are shorter? We're used to immediate gratification, and so the way that our system was designed with the checks and balances is intentionally slow, but it doesn't fit like our modern sensibilities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, like, obviously the modern use of the filibuster, as an example, has caused, I think, it's been really, really problematic in the sense of people feel like they voted to change Congress, they voted for trifecta governments, and then what they voted for doesn't happen, especially when the Democrats are in office, because the Democrats are citing the filibuster or the parliamentarian or their rotating villain. It's Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema, Joe Lieberman, Zell Miller. There's always a rotating villain who the Democrats are constantly saying, well, we want to do this, but we can't. So I think that whole process, I think, has caused people to believe that no matter what they vote for, the donor class will win. I also think that going back to season one of Master Plan, the looking at legalizing corruption, I think the idea that politicians will say things and promise things, but are actually mostly serving the people who are buying the elections for them. That is also, you see that in practice. And part of that's blamed on the sort of legislative compromise process where they promise big things and then it gets whittled down. But I think there is a sense that the whittling down is not just the compromises, regional compromises, or this or that congressman needed this or that project, that the compromises are corruption. And I don't think that's a wrong perception. I think that's real. So I think that angst, we keep voting for things and we're not getting what we want, I think is only now supercharging the political push for concentrating power in the executive branch, for an authoritarian who says, I can be the one who gets things done. Now, I would say this, there are other solutions to the gridlock problem than an authoritarian, right? Like there are other solutions. There is winning election after election after election over a long enough time that there is a governing coalition. I mean, this is, to use the New Deal coalition as an example. The New Deal happened because Roosevelt didn't just win one election, and the Democrats didn't just win one election. They won election after election after election, and they had big fights with Congress. They had big fights certainly with the courts. There was a court packing fight, and some people argued FDR overstepped. Others said that he had the fight just to get the court to back down. But the point is that the New Deal didn't happen because of one election. It happened because there was a governing coalition over multiple elections. Yeah. And I think, look, in a sense we are impatient, and social media and our current media environment has rewarded instant gratification. But to structurally change society, or like, let's use an example of like, how do you change the healthcare system? Look, that's going to be an epic battle. It's not just going to be one fell swoop. And I think we have to I'm not telling people to like have patience and not be mad, but look at these projects in slightly longer periods of time rather than 15 minutes.
Yeah, there's a theory, the Moon Party and the Sun Party, and that there's supposed to be one party that's a dominant party for a period of time. And we haven't had that since, I guess, the Reagan era might be the last time we had any sort of semblance of that. And we've just been oscillating back and forth with these wave elections. And so how would you expect anybody to get anything done with our current system? Let me ask you this, because I feel like one of the great things that I like about this podcast, especially when it pertains to the unitary executive theory, is you're really showing how we got from here to there, right? How we got to Trump. And I think Trump's an example of sort of what happens when this unitary executive theory is allowed to kind of persist and is put on steroids. And he is building off of ideas that came from previous eras. On the other hand, I think that, like, although all modern presidents have probably had more power than they should and have done things that were probably not, within actually their constitutional prerogative, Trump is just quantitatively and qualitatively worse and more authoritarian. And so I'm one of the people who doesn't think that Trump was the, like, obvious end to the Republican Party. Like, if Mitt Romney wins in 2012, if he beats Barack Obama in 2012, you probably never get Trump. And There'd still be bad things about the Republican Party, but it wouldn't be this. And so this is a long windup. But how many? Again, I think that the unitary executive theory like maps very well onto our current predicament. How about the other stuff? How much of that actually does apply to Donald Trump and his sort of unique badness?
I mean, what other stuff are we talking about?
Let's take like campaign finance reform, for example, and see like that's more of a season one thing, right?
Right.
Um, I I don't so Donald Trump's type of corruption, he's doing things like, you know, crypto stuff, the stuff
Right.
that doesn't apply to the old-fashioned corruption.
Yeah. I would say that Donald Trump, when it comes to something like corruption, I think that Donald Trump, there was a moment in the 2016 election where he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I know money corrupts because I buy politicians. Right. I mean, remember this moment where he was
Yeah.
like, I give to a bunch of different people and I get things from them and the system is corrupt. And it was kind of this like genius breaking the fourth wall moment where he's like, basically, I am corrupt and that's just what the system is. And so anyone denying that the system is corrupt is ridiculous. I am uncorruptible because I am basically rich enough that I don't, I don't. I'm not a politician taking money to use money to get
Yeah.
reelected and giving out a favor.
I think Dave Chappelle pointed to that moment as like when he knew Trump was going to win when he said
Totally.
that. It was
It
yeah.
was incredible. I mean, it was an incredible moment because it was like a lot of the things he said were true, and it's in service of ended up being in service of the corrupt system itself. But in a way, I think that we're not used to, and in a self-enriching way, right? I think the way we've thought about corruption for a long time, and I do think this is still very much the case, is that the typical politician who is not a billionaire, who can't self-finance, has to go to private donors and essentially promise them things in exchange for them bankrolling their campaign. I mean, you need to run a well-financed campaign to get your message out, to get enough voters to know who you are, to get elected to an office like the House, Congress, or the Senate or governor and the like. And so we know that system is inherently, like there is an inherent quid pro quo, whether it's legal or not. There is an inherent quid pro quo in that system.
Mhm.
Donald Trump does participate in that quid pro quo. I mean, let's not forget, like 2024 election, he reportedly has this meeting with fossil fuel donors and says, "You give me $1 billion, I'll give you the policies that you want." I mean, that is inherently transactional, right? So that is kind of very old school. Where I think Donald Trump has sort of shocked everyone is that the self-enriching, the money coming into the family and the family businesses part of this, I think has shocked everybody. But I still would say that this is sort of like the logical conclusion of or culmination of where everything was going, with a Supreme Court that has, for instance, had a string of cases overturning bribery prosecutions, narrowing further and further the definition on the books of prosecutable bribery. I mean, to the point where only a few years ago there was that Indiana case where the mayor hands out a municipal contract. The contractor, a little while later, gives him $10,000. He gets prosecuted, convicted. The conviction gets overturned because the Supreme Court says, well, the money coming after, the sequence of this means that the money wasn't a bribe, it was a tip. It was a gratuity. I mean, that's literally, I mean, that sounds insane. Like people will hear me saying this and not they're thinking I'm exaggerating. That like it's literally what the
Wow.
Supreme Court ruled. And my point is that Donald Trump, again, is an extreme cartoonish culmination, but it is a culmination. And I think what he ultimately asks of all of us is, if he's going to push the limits that far, what he's presuming is there are no limits. Nobody will stand up. No new laws will be passed. This whole thing will never be contained. And so I think ultimately Trump is a challenge, whether it's on presidential power or on something like corruption. He's challenging the norms and begging us all to answer the question, are there going to be any limits? Right? I mean, what I worry about truly is like, think about the Iran war for a second. I don't care where you are on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to have this war. Let's just set that aside. I think it is a terrifying future that we can have a president of any party who knows that the population will say nothing, who knows that the laws will say nothing, who can just wake up and start a massive global war. Like, that is a terrifying thing. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, like, that should terrify you.
Yes, I agree. And speaking, it's not that's what you just said is totally true. But part of what happens is during wars, during national emergencies, presidential power expands. Like over the 4th of July last year, I took my kids to Fort McHenry in Baltimore, and we were just touring it. Super cool. You know, they raise the flag, the Star Spangled Banner, and all that. You can help do that. And we're walking through, and I see this jail cell, and come to find out, Francis Scott Key's grandson was arrested and held in prison at Fort McHenry because during the Civil War, he had written some bad things about Abraham Lincoln in a Baltimore newspaper. So his grandfather literally wrote the national anthem at Fort McHenry, like looking at Fort McHenry. That's where the flag was. Now, the grandson was arrested by, I'm a huge fan of Abe Lincoln, but that just goes to show you, even in a real emergency, not a fake one, a real emergency, the Civil War, Lincoln, obviously, Maryland, these states surrounded Washington, D.C. He had a vested interest to suppress opposition. But even a good president, Abraham Lincoln, arrested somebody who dared to write something bad about him in a newspaper. And so one could imagine what if Lincoln would do that, what might Donald Trump do in a real, not a fake, but a real emergency?
It's really scary, right? I mean, warrantless wiretapping, the internet, like how much more of that they have the power to do at the flip of a switch. And that says nothing, as you suggest, about more authoritarian tactics like incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think, as much as I do wonder about the No Kings protests, is what's being said really that they just don't like the current king. I do think underneath it, there is an idea that there are lines that should not be crossed. And I think that is why I think, even though I have some questions about what the No Kings movement is really, what its goals are, I do think that is in the foundation of it, that there should be some basic boundaries here, that we do not want anyone having limitless power. But I also think we have to be honest with ourselves that this has been at times a bipartisan project, that trying to blame only one party. Now, I think the record shows in the last 50 years that the primary advocates of concentrated executive power have really been on the right, the conservative movement. But I would also say the Obama administration marched into court and made legal arguments that the president should have the right, and does have the right, to extrajudicially assassinate American citizens who the executive branch unilaterally deems as terrorists. Right? That whole drone war set of situations. I mean, you can argue that the people that they targeted were not great people, or you didn't like them, or were national security threats. But to articulate a legal argument and get it validated by the courts that the president can make those choices without any oversight at all. I mean,
and it's for good things too. I mean, Obama, the Dreamers, that's something that's like a noble thing. But Obama had said, I can't do this alone. I'm not a king. I can't, And then he did it. You know what I mean? And so that's an example of, even if it's ostensibly a noble or good end in mind, I think it rubs the public the wrong way and kind of greases the skids for, hey, if they're just going to do whatever they want to do, we'll do whatever we want to do.
Well, and listen, I mean, one of the things I think the founders didn't get everything right. I think they got a lot of things wrong, a lot of things terribly wrong. But I do think that, like, we talked about, like, the original stuff, what the Constitution's premised on. One is, like, don't have all the power be in the hands of one person. I think the other, perhaps unstated part of that is, especially when it comes to something like Congress, the reason you want Congress to have the power of the purse, as an example, or the declaration of war powers. Maybe this was unstated, but in the practical effect of that is that the executive then has to presumably go out and get public consent for
Yes.
these policies. That civilization operates better when the government is acting with the consent of the governed. So if you have to go out and campaign and make a case, a public case for a war, and then we go to war, that's better for society and stability of the society, rather than just waking up one day and ordering a war with no public consent at all.
Yeah,
Like, I was an opponent of the Iraq War, right? I was a big opponent of the Iraq War.
Consensus.
Okay, and they got consent for that war by peddling lies about WMDs. And
I don't know if it was lies. They were certainly wrong.
They were wrong
about it.
The point is, it was inaccurate information.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
sure.
I'm one of these people who's like, under no circumstances do you ever have to hand it to Dick Cheney, right? I'm one of those people. But to be clear, like, at least they went out and made a case, right? Like, when you look at the polls of going into the Iraq War, like, the polls were at the beginning of the war, they were supportive of it. I was not, but the president and the vice president went out and made a case and had the consent of a majority of the public, whether I liked it or not. That is better for society and civilization than Donald Trump waking up with no consent, making no public case at all for the situation, the attack on Iran. Like, I guess that's a long way of saying is that I think the founders, one of the things that they did get right was, like, society operates better if the people in power have to constantly go to the public and get their consent. And that's not what we have right now.
Totally agree. Let me ask you this. The master plan, unlike you and I, we're on a podcast right now, but this is like a conversation podcast, an interview podcast. They're a dime a dozen, but I like doing it, and I listen to a lot of them. What you have done is like more like a highly produced audio documentary, which is a lot more work. But so let me ask you, why did you choose to go that direction versus a series of conversations about unitary executive authority?
I really appreciate the question. It's not an easy decision because you're right, it takes a ton of work. I mean, this is the reason why season 1 took a year and a half. Season 2 took a year and a half. It's because I think to really tell a story like this, you have to have enough time to go deep and to, I mean, we have reporters traveling to different archives to pull original documents that are not online. I mean, we have all sorts of interviews to do, and to ultimately cobble it together as one story arc is not easy. But I think I think, look, I'm a fan of conversational podcasts, audio stuff like that as well. That I listen to a lot of that. But I think I don't want our media environment to lose the deeper storytelling that requires deeper research and, by the way, deeper focus by listeners, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I'm not being a scold here, but I think it is sad that like people are reading fewer and fewer books, and now people are watching fewer and fewer long form video content, fewer and fewer like movie length products on video. And I think Master Plan is one of those ones. Master Plan is not a podcast that you can like, you're doing the dishes and you're half listening and you can tune in and tune out. Master Plan is like, you got to be listening because the story is like one big story. And if you miss this, you're not going to understand this. And I guess what I would say is like, I still want media like that because I still think there is a unique value in that. And when you're talking about something like a 50-year plot to legalize corruption or the 50-year effort to concentrate power in the White House, I think those kinds of society-wide civilization-shaping topics require something deeper.
And you've worked for Bernie Sanders twice. Once, I think you were like his press secretary. You went with him into Canada from Vermont to do the drug reimportation project. And then you were his press secretary when he ran for president. He is just a phenomena. What's his well, like one time I asked like Newt Gingrich, somebody who worked for Newt, like what's his secret, Because Newt, a million ideas and he's got all this energy, whether you like him or not. And the person said, effectively, he imports ideas. He takes other people's ideas and then steals them. I mean, it was much more, nicer than that. But it makes sense because I don't know. Recently, he had a crazy idea about building a new Strait of Hormuz by using nuclear weapons. And so I think he might have imported that idea. But I always like to find out, like, when people are just kind of very impressive, if there's any secrets. So, what did you learn from working for Bernie?
I think that I learned a lot from working for Bernie. I mean, I worked for Bernie when he was an independent in the House, and to see the inside of Congress from a real independent view. And Bernie Sanders really does have certainly back in the late 90s, it was a very independent view. His view is now more center in a lot of ways to the Democratic Party than it certainly was 20, 30 years ago. It was fascinating. I think that Bernie Sanders is focused on the power dynamics and the power inequities in the sense that every issue can be boiled down to who has the power and who doesn't. And so I think one of the things he has done that others have not done, or that sets him apart, is that he has stayed focused on that through line on every issue for 40, 50 years. And so I think the sort of never losing sight of that, even while being in national politics, is what makes, in a sense, Bernie Sanders unique. I mean, it's not to say that everyone who's there a long time sells out, but the sharp edges tend to get sanded down because the culture of Washington in particular is one that rewards complicity, rewards etiquette. And I think Bernie Sanders never succumbed to that. Sometimes that hurts him, and like if he's pushing a bill and like he can't, he can't schmooze somebody into supporting it. But for the vast majority of the time, that doggedness and focus on the power dynamic, I think, is what has set him apart. And I should add, I think that's, in a sense, what movement leaders, some of the most effective movement leaders in our history have done. I tend to think of Bernie Sanders at this point. I think the best potential metaphor for Bernie Sanders for us to understand what he means in politics is actually Barry Goldwater. That if you look at Barry Goldwater from 1964 to, let's say, the early 1980s, Barry Goldwater runs for president as a conservative ideologue. The sort of Bernie Sanders of the right. That's a little too reductionist, but basically puts out runs a really ideological presidential campaign and ends up losing in a landslide. And the conventional wisdom is he's done. His movement got rejected. It was the biggest landslide in history at that point. And then 16 years later, Barry Goldwater's acolyte, the guy who spoke for him on the campaign, Ronald Reagan, is elected president. So you go 16 years from a landslide, Barry Goldwater landslide, to a Goldwaterite being elected president in a massive landslide. And I guess my point when I think about Bernie Sanders is I think there's a similar trajectory there. Like Bernie Sanders, seen as sort of a kind of people eye rolling him. He's on the fringe. He runs for president. He doesn't win, but it makes a very big impact inside of the party he's trying to impact, like Goldwater impacted the Republican Party. And I think now you see Bernie Sanders, a lot of what he says is now basically in the center of the Democratic Party. And you're seeing Bernie Sanders acolytes being elected to various offices. So I guess I take the long view also on Bernie Sanders, that there aren't a lot of people in politics like that. They don't come around very often, and he's one of the few.
I love it. John the Baptist to Jesus, almost.
There you go. It's like a dynamic that's like as old as human history.
So is AOC the promised one?
Yeah, I don't. The thing with Bernie Sanders is, anybody who knows him, he has never he's never run his political operation as sort of a I bequeath the throne to you. I think I will say this. One of the things that Bernie's that's not great, I would be a little bit critical of, is that Bernie Sanders has been sort of a prophet of a set of ideas. He hasn't done as good a job as I think other political operators might have in building a sort of vibrant political machine in a traditional way. And I think a good side of that is like he's not somebody who's just going to like hand the royal scepter to AOC, right? It just doesn't work like that. I think
people aren't good at picking their own successor as a rule.
Right. So I think the downside is like sometimes you're like, if you had a better political, a sort of more organized, hierarchical political machine, you could help more over here, down ballot over there, down. So it doesn't exactly operate like a traditional political machine.
I do like the Barry Goldwater analogy though, because both of them, Bernie seemed old when he was young. You know what I mean? They're both code older, and they had this charisma and excitement. Like, remember there were the Goldwater girls, like Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl.
Totally.
Like they both had these like youth movements. So like, why are you excited about this old guy?
It's like an charisma that and look, I was his speechwriter in 2020, and I think I what I understood it to be was that the anti-charisma, slightly prickly vibe ended up coding not just as older, it codes as authentic.
Yes.
Like I'm not going to shave down my hard edges because I'm just going to keep it real. Yep. And I think Goldwater had that. I think Bernie Sanders has that. I think and I think like that's why young people in particular flocked to Bernie's campaign. I think in part because it was like this guy clearly doesn't give a shit. He's willing to like go for it.
I think you're totally right. Before I get you out of here, I just have to say, I really liked Don't Look Up.
Thank you.
I thought it was really funny and really smart. It got a lot of attention. I actually think it's probably underrated. But if you would talk about that, like what you did with that project, I know it was like a collaboration, and also just the idea, because if you try to make a piece of political propaganda, it doesn't work. It's not funny. But if you can like make a point that's legitimately make a legitimately funny movie that also makes some smart political points, that's a masterpiece.
That's the sweet spot. So that movie, which I think you can see behind me for anybody who's watching, I still have the movie poster from the movie inside of the movie. That was one of my favorite parts of the movie. If people have seen the movie, it's about an asteroid headed towards Earth, a comet headed towards Earth, and sort of nobody cares. And to the point where the movie that is about to come out inside of the movie on the day of the impact is an asteroid hits Earth movie. So I have the movie poster from inside the movie. So yes, sort of breaking the fourth wall again, if you will, and looking and sort of pointing the mirror at ourselves and laughing at ourselves, I think was kind of the vision of how to tell a deeper truth. And I think the deeper truth was, I mean, some people saw it as a climate movie. Some people saw it as a pandemic movie about indicting our inability to find consensus around scientific facts, right? I think, and I think that ultimately, underneath the movie, we were trying to ask the question: why can't we take seriously anything that we need to take seriously? Is the distraction machine and the entertainment machine and the polarization machines, are all of these machines so powerful that we can no longer find any kind of common ground, consensus, and focus on what we need to focus on, right? Like, and because if the answer is those machines have too much power over us, we're never going to be able to solve any problem. And I want to be clear: the movie is not prophecy. The movie was designed to be cautionary. I don't yet think we're at the final scene of that movie, for those who've seen it, where we're at the table and the die has been cast and there's nothing we can do. The point is to say, let's not get to that point. Let's ask ourselves, why are we unable to find consensus? And if not consensus, then at least attentional focus on the most important things we should be focused on, right? And here's the thing: as much as I'm like, wake up at some days and say, I feel like we're living inside of our movie, and this is this feels bad because I don't want Don't Look Up to be a documentary. Like, as many days as I have like that, I also think there are optimistic points here. As an example, I think that the very recent awareness that social media, addictive technologies, the phone, et cetera, all of the things that Jonathan Haidt has been saying about the anxious generation. I think our sudden, or at least it feels sudden, arguably belated but abrupt, awareness that this is actually very bad for society can be interpreted as, in a sense, us saying, hey, one of these machines that we're making fun of in something like Don't Look Up as a problem, one of these machines we're actually holding up and saying, hey, this is a problem. And I think that's actually really good, because the first step towards solving problems is an awareness that the thing is a problem. So the idea that our attention is being pulled in different directions to distract us from the real problems at hand, recognizing that as a challenge, the societal awareness of that is a big deal. And so I am actually heartened by that when I think about Don't Look Up, because Don't Look Up is a world where these technologies of distraction are so ubiquitous and no one is questioning them. So I do think on that score, I mean, the climate crisis is worse. I think anti-science denialism, Maha, RFK Jr. I mean, I think that's worse. But the implicit awareness that that there are technologies and machines that are trying to polarize and distract us and addict us, I think that awareness, like I'm feeling very, very encouraged by that.
Very good. Well, if you haven't seen the film Don't Look Up, it is an excellent commentary on a lot of what is happening in the world today. So check that out. Make sure to check out The Lever and this great new second season of the Master Plan podcast. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with, David?
No, I just appreciate the chance to talk with you. I really appreciate everyone listening, and I really encourage everybody who listens to the podcast to, whether it's on concentration of presidential power, the legalization of corruption, to just keep in mind that many, if not most, of the challenges that we face in this society, in this world, are the result of specific plans by specific people with specific goals. Whether you agree or disagree with those goals, I think the one thing that should be encouraging as a reminder is, as bad as those problems are, if humans can create those problems, if they are not forces of inevitable nature, it means that we can solve those problems. If you don't like that corruption was legalized through a 50-year master plan, remember, there can be plans to roll that plan back. The people who created a lot of these problems, when they started on their plans were pie in the sky. And like, if you're sitting there and you want to create an imperial presidency after Watergate, right? You're like, there's no way we're going to be able to create a unitary executive after Watergate. What, right? They were actually dreamers. I mean, some might say they were villainous dreamers, but they were dreamers. And I think we have to remember that while things may not feel realistic now to solve problems here in the, taking the first step, that the arc of history is long. The issue is it takes a lot of work to bend it towards justice.
Indeed. Thank you so much. It's a great conversation. David Sirota, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.